You see it in the headlines every single day, right? The endless chaos in Syria and Iraq. It just feels like this story that has no beginning and no end. But what if I told you the real cause wasn't something that happened last week, but a single, simple line drawn in the sand more than 100 years ago? Let's follow that line and see where it leads. I mean, you know the names: ISIS, Russia, the United States. It's just this tangled, awful mess that's been going on for years now. But what's the real reason? Why is this conflict so stubborn? Why can't anyone seem to fix it?
Well, the key to understanding all the violence we see today, it's not in the last decade, it's not even in the last 50 years. To really get it, we've got to jump in a time machine and go way back to one single decision, one line on a map that set the stage for a whole century of turmoil. And we're going to trace it right from the source.
Okay, so here's the absolute heart of the issue. Countries like Syria and Iraq, they're not like Japan or France, places with thousands of years of shared history and culture that glues everyone together. No, these states are recent, and more importantly, they're artificial creations. To get what I mean by an artificial state, let me give you a perfect analogy from history, a place called Manchukuo. So back in the 1930s, Japan invades a piece of China, puts a puppet emperor on the throne, and calls it an independent country. But it wasn't. It was a total sham, completely controlled by Japan from behind the scenes. It was a fake country. Hold on to that thought because it's key. And here's the kicker. When Japan did this in the 1930s, it wasn't some brilliant new idea. They were basically ripping off a playbook written a decade earlier by Britain and France over in the Middle East. The Europeans did the exact same thing. Drew lines on a map, installed puppet leaders they could control, and created these countries that had absolutely no basis in reality. Syria and Iraq, they were the original Manchukuo.
All right, so this leads us right to the pivotal moment, the one single act that some have called the original sin of the entire modern Middle East.
Picture this. It's World War I. The Ottoman Empire is falling apart. And two diplomats, a British guy named Sykes and a French guy named Picot, they sit down with a map. In secret, they decide to just carve up all the Arab lands for themselves. These two men are about to decide the fate of millions of people with a few strokes of a pen. And this quote, man, it just says it all. They literally took a ruler and drew straight lines right through the desert, creating the borders we now know as Iraq and Syria. They paid zero attention to the people who actually live there, the ancient tribes, the different ethnic groups like Arabs and Kurds, or the religious splits between Sunnis and Shias. It was just pure colonial arrogance. And you can bet, an act like that had consequences, a century's worth. Because these fake nations they built were fundamentally unstable. And that instability led directly to the rise of some really brutal dictators. You can literally draw a straight line from one event to the next. After Sykes-Picot, the British and French put in puppet kings so they could suck out all the oil. Of course, that made people furious, which led to revolutions in the 60s, backed by the Soviets. And that's how we got strong men like Saddam Hussein and Hafez al-Assad. They managed to hold these fractured places together for decades, until outside events like the US invasion of Iraq and the Arab Spring finally blew it all apart. The best way to think about it is like a pressure cooker. Those artificial borders created this intense pressure of ethnic and religious hatred. And the dictators, well, they were the lid clamped on top. They used brute force, secret police, you name it, to keep the whole thing from exploding. It looked like peace from the outside, but really it was just suppression. And what's really wild is what life was actually like under that lid. Because these were Soviet-backed regimes, they were super secular. Saddam's Iraq, for instance, was absolutely ruthless in crushing any kind of Islamic extremism. It was a society where you'd see women without veils, with more rights than in a lot of other places in the region. It's a lot more complicated than the simple evil dictator story we usually get. So what happens when you take the lid off a pressure cooker that's been on the stove for 100 years? Yeah, it explodes. And honestly, it's like a recipe for chaos, and it's tragically simple. Step 1, an outside power, like the US and Iraq, removes the strongman. Step 2, that lid is gone. Step 3, all those old tensions that Sykes and Picot ignored for 100 years just erupt. And step 4, the fake country starts to break apart along its real fault lines, Arab versus Kurd, Sunni versus Shia. And right out of that explosion, out of that specific historical mess, you get a group like ISIS. And understanding what they said they wanted is absolutely critical to understanding this whole thing. Because if you actually look at what ISIS said their goals were, it's pretty eye-opening. Yeah, the religious stuff was there, but their number one political goal, their top priority, was to physically destroy the Sykes-Picot border between Iraq and Syria. For them, that line in the sand was the ultimate symbol of everything that had gone wrong.
And that, right there, is the main takeaway from all this. The endless war we see isn't fundamentally a problem with Islam. It's a problem of illegitimate, fake countries that were smashed together by foreign empires, forcing people who hated each other to live under one flag they never chose.
And you know what's crazy? For 400 years before all this, the region was actually pretty peaceful. It was all part of the Ottoman Empire. And you know why it worked? The Ottomans mostly left people alone. They let local groups run their own affairs. They didn't try to force a Kurd and an Arab and a Sunni and a Shia into one box and call it a country. So this leaves us with a really tough and maybe uncomfortable final question. If those artificial borders, those lines in the sand, are the original sin, if they're the root cause of all this bloodshed, can you ever have real, lasting peace without getting rid of them first? It kind of makes you wonder if any solution that tries to keep those old maps intact is just doomed from the start.